Welcome to the deep dive. We're digging into a whole stack of reports and rumors today, all focused on Apple's macOS and where it's heading.
That's right. Apple, well, they never really stand still, do they? Always tweaking, always building. And these sources you've pulled together, they give us a really interesting glimpse into what might be next for the Mac.
Yeah, and also some important stuff happening right now with privacy and security.
Definitely.
So our mission today, we're going to try and, cut through the noise, find the really key takeaways from all this, and help you understand what these rumored changes and current updates actually mean for, well, for how you use your Mac.
Sounds good. Let's get started.
Okay, so diving in, the first thing that really jumps out from these reports is the buzz around the next version of macOS. There's a potential new name floating around, Tahoe.
Yes, Tahoe. And what's interesting is that the reports aren't just saying it's a new name. They're strongly suggesting Tahoe could mark the first major visual redesign for macOS since Big Sur.
Since 2020, right?
Exactly. And one source even framed it as the third big interface overhaul since Apple started using those California place names.
Yeah.
That feels pretty significant, more than just tweaking icons.
And they're suggesting the name Tahoe itself might be a kind of clue. Lake Tahoe, famous for reflections.
Right. One report picked up on that, maybe mirroring the striking visuals they expect in the next wave of Apple software. It sounds like they might be aiming for a very specific look and feel.
Interesting.
And if we connect that Tahoe redesign idea to, well, an even bigger potential change the sources talk about, it links directly to how Apple might name all its operating systems from now on.
Oh, right. Not just Mac-O.
No, across the board. The reports indicate they might ditch the current numbering, iOS 19, macOS 15, watchOS 11, and switch to a year-based system.
Like getting a new car model, a 26 version.
Pretty much exactly like that, yeah.
Yeah.
The thinking seems to be because these new versions might launch later in 2025, maybe not the usual summer reveal, they'd brand them for the next year.
So macOS 26, iOS 26, iPadOS 26, all lined up.
That's the idea being reported. It could signal a more unified yearly refresh cycle for all the software, maybe timed closer to new hardware or just the calendar year itself, a big branding shift.
Okay, so while we're looking ahead at these sort of big picture changes like Tahoe and 26, the reports also flag some important things happening, well, right now or coming very soon in the current macOS updates.
Clipboard privacy was a notable one.
Right. What's changing there?
Well, it looks like a technical update, mirroring things we've seen on iOS recently. The developer docs apparently show a significant change to the macOS pasteboard, the clipboard.
So it's more than just those pop-up alerts asking if you want to paste.
Yeah, it seems to be going deeper, adding new controls for users. The implication is that apps might need new permissions or maybe use updated code to access copy data.
Giving you more fine-grained control, maybe, like what gets pasted.
Potentially, yes. More control over what an app can access from your clipboard. It's kind of a quiet change, but definitely a privacy plus.
And still on the topic of current updates, that redesigned Apple Mail app, the one that came to iPhone with iOS 18.2.
Yes.
The reports say that's expected on Mac and iPad pretty soon, maybe macOS 15.4.
That sounds about right. And it's a good reminder, isn't it? Even after a big OS launch like macOS 15 Sequoia, some key features actually arrive later in those point updates.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the reports mention that even in the early macOS 15 Sequoia betas, some of the big WWDC announcements weren't there yet. iPhone mirroring, and especially Apple Intelligence.
Right. iPhone mirroring was kind of expected to land in later betas, but Apple Intelligence, that rollout seems more complex. It wasn't in the initial betas.
And wasn't there something, didn't one report mention a bug recently? Something about Apple Intelligence getting re-enabled for people who turned it off?
Yes, that was mentioned. A bug in recent macOS and iOS updates, it apparently did that for some users. It was temporary, likely unintentional, but... Well, it does make you think about the layers of control, doesn't it? Apple's control versus the user's perceived control, especially with these really complex integrated AI features.
It really highlights how tricky integrating that stuff is.
Absolutely. And, speaking of integration, another source just made a quick point that even as features become more similar across devices, Macs are still missing some specific customization things you can do on iPadOS. So there are still differences.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to security and privacy. Absolutely crucial stuff. The sources had quite a few insights here, painting a picture of, well, the ongoing fight against threats on the Mac.
We learned a bit more about how Apple is boosting its own built-in defenses. Specifically, what kinds of malware your Mac can find and remove by itself.
That's X-Protect, right?
Yeah.
The thing that works in the background.
That's really exactly
Yeah.
XProtect. It uses signatures to spot known malware. And security researchers, they keep analyzing the updates to its rules to figure out what new threats Apple is targeting. It shows Apple's constantly updating those core defenses.
But just relying on the built-in tools isn't always enough, is it?
No, definitely not. Reports also flagged vulnerabilities found inside popular third-party apps. Cisco Talos found one in Microsoft apps for macOS, for instance.
Potentially letting hackers spy on users.
That was the potential risk, yes. Microsoft has been patching it, but it's a reminder that, the software you run on macOS is also part of your security picture.
Right. And then there was another layer mentioned, enterprise security.
Yes, a recent study highlighted a security gap, specifically in how businesses deploy Macs. The problem wasn't always Mac OS itself, but sometimes misconfigurations in things like EDR systems, endpoint detection and response.
Those extra security layers companies use?
Precisely. It just shows that securing Macs in a corporate setting has its own set of challenges beyond just the operating system.
And pulling back a bit, one report brought up something from a few years ago, a sort of huge macOS privacy promise related to app notarization.
Ah, yes. That dates back to around the Big Sur launch, when Apple's servers for checking app notarization went down. Notarization is that process where developers submit apps for automated security checks before users can easily run them if downloaded outside the App Store.
And when the check failed, it revealed more about user activity than expected.
That was the issue, yes. The report basically served as a reminder that this promise Apple made back then about improving the privacy aspects of that check might still be, well, unfulfilled according to that source. It shows some privacy debates have long tails.
Okay, so one last big area the reports touched on, Intel Macs. A big question for many users, right? What's the deal now that Apple's fully moved to Apple Silicon?
It's a really important question. Apple finished that Silicon transition in 2023, and we've seen support for older Intel models get dropped with new macOS versions since then.
So, with macOS 15 Sequoia, what's the situation for people still on Intel, especially like machines from the last 6 years or so?
Well, the news is a bit mixed. The reports confirm that most Intel Macs that could run macOS 14 Sonoma can also run macOS 15 Sequoia. So that's good news for compatibility this year.
But there's a catch.
A big one. The sources are clear. Those Intel Macs do not get the headline Apple Intelligence features. Those require Apple Silicon.
Ah, so they get the OS update, but miss out on arguably the biggest new thing.
Exactly. And this obviously leads to the question about long-term support. While the list of supported Intel models didn't shrink dramatically this year compared to last year, based on the patterns Apple has set since the M1 chip arrived, the sources really highlight the uncertainty. How many more major macOS updates will Intel Macs actually get? Nobody knows for sure, but the clock is definitely ticking.
Even if it didn't speed up drastically with Sequoia itself.
Right. And just one very specific point for users on the absolute latest M4 Macs. The reports mentioned they're having some trouble running virtual machines with older macOS versions right now. That's a niche issue, maybe, but important for developers or power users.
Okay, so let's try and pull all this together from our deep dive. We talked about the potential next big thing for macOS, maybe called Tahoe.
Yeah, and the report suggests it's not just a name, but possibly the third major visual redesign in the macOS California era, following Big Sur. A potentially significant shift.
We also covered that rumored move to year-based, naming macOS 26, iOS 26, aligning everything across Apple's OS lineup, maybe changing the release cadence too.
And then we looked at a whole range of current developments. Those upcoming clipboard privacy enhancements, which sound technically quite significant.
The redesigned Mail app arriving soon.
Right. Plus the whole complex picture of Mac security, Apple's own XProtect updates, but also vulnerabilities in third-party apps, potential misconfigurations in enterprise setups.
And even that lingering question about the notarization privacy promise from a few years back.
And finally, we address the Intel Mac situation. Yes, many can run Sequoia, but no Apple Intelligence. And the sources definitely flag the ongoing uncertainty about future major updates for those machines.
What this really seems to highlight, digging through all this, is that constant tension in macOS development. You've got the push for exciting, maybe visually dramatic future stuff like Tahoe and the 26 naming.
And then you have the fundamental, maybe less glamorous, but essential work of constantly improving security, refining privacy, and managing these big hardware transitions.
Yeah. And staying on top of all these details, it's not just tech trivia, is it? It helps you anticipate what your Mac might look like soon, understand the security measures in place, and maybe even inform decisions about future hardware.
It really does. And maybe this leaves you with a thought to consider as you process these reports. As macOS potentially gears up for a visual refresh with Tahoe and this 26.4 rebrand, what parts of the Mac experience do you personally hope Apple keeps sacred? Or maybe, what do you hope they completely reinvent?
Yeah, how might these changes, the big visual ones and the technical stuff underneath, actually affect your own workflow or what you look for in your next Mac?
Definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. Lots to chew on as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of macOS.